I think easily the most overlooked Beatle, the soulful Beatle, George Harrison. That song was written in 1969 during what was for George Harrison a very tumultuous, difficult year of his life. He says in his autobiography that he went through some health issues. He temporarily quit the Beatles. That seems like a terrible career move. And he was noticing that the Beatles record label that they had established to do all their recording through and all their distribution through Apple Records was becoming more and more corporate. And he didn't like it. He felt like every day he went into work, he was having to deal with accountants and bookkeepers, and he had to sign this and sign that, and he just couldn't take it anymore. So in the spring of 1969, after the very long, very hard English winter, much like a Michigan winter, he goes over to his friend Eric Clapton's house. That's a sentence I'd like to be able to say at some point. I went over to my friend Eric Clapton's house. He borrowed an acoustic guitar, and there in the warm spring sunshine, he wandered around Eric Clapton's garden with a borrowed acoustic guitar, and he wrote that song in one day. Now, I suppose if you are a resident of Michigan in the year 2014, you probably know what George Harrison is describing when he talks about a long, hard, cold winter. Do you remember what it was like the first day that the temperature during the daytime was above freezing? Or that there weren't any clouds? Let me tell you what happens at my house. This happens annually, every year, when we hit late March, early April, since we've moved here and lived here. My wife, who would readily admit to you that winter is her least favorite season of the year, strips down to her bikini and runs. Okay, I'm exaggerating a little bit. Runs out onto our deck. It does not matter if there is still 2 feet of snow on our deck, and she sprawls in a chaise lounge and enjoys the crisp, hot, 35-degree sunshine and celebrates the arrival of spring. I bet you felt that way this year. But see, if you listen to the story of what this song was about, it's not really about seasons. It's not really about the temperature of winter changing to the warmth of spring. It's about what George Harrison was going through. He was going through this upheaval. He was going through a hard time. He felt like his life was winter. It was icy. Not much made sense anymore. He didn't like the way that it was changing. And so he hopes that spring will come. He hopes for the sun to rise. You know, if you and I had been around 2,000 years ago, and we had been attached or associated with Jesus in some way, we would have known that feeling too. If we would have been one of those first believers in Jesus, or one of the first followers of Jesus called his disciples, we'd have known that feeling too. You need to put yourself in the place of the names of the disciples that you know. People like Matthew and James and John and Peter. Need to imagine what they just went through. They had signed up to follow around and learn from this pretty radical, divergent spiritual teacher called a rabbi named Jesus of Nazareth. And for many of them, that meant they put their careers on hiatus. They were no longer gainfully employed as they wandered around the Palestinian countryside, listening to Jesus, dialoguing with Jesus, disagreeing with Jesus, watching Jesus interact with all kinds of people, the accepted and the not accepted, the powerful and the weak, the sick and the lame, and the well too. They've given their life to this Jesus. They believe in what this Jesus says. They long so much for what he teaches to be true in their lives and in their world and in their families' lives. For 3 to 3.5 years they did this. And you can imagine that every week, every month, every year that passed, their conviction grew that they believed in this man, Jesus. And around about the halfway point of their 3-year association with Jesus, he would have started to hint to them that things would always not be sunny, that this story was going to take a tragic turn. And Jesus was wise enough to see it coming. And sure enough, 2,000 years ago last week, Jesus' prediction was proven right. And so these disciples travel with Jesus, this Jesus to whom they've sold out their lives, to Jerusalem to celebrate one of the great Jewish feasts, as was common in those days. And there they watch Jesus do verbal combat with the Jewish religious and cultural leaders that have grown to hate him and to fear everything he stands for. They fear the kind of world he is trying to create. They fear his morality that is unlike theirs. They fear the principles that he lives by and tells others to live by. They fear and hate him. And so a plot emerges because among Jesus' disciples, there is also someone who hates Jesus as well and just wants a little more money, 30 pieces of silver to be exact. And the Jewish leaders used the greed and the lack of character of Judas Iscariot to kill Jesus, to murder him. These are the events that we remember 2 days ago on what we call Good Friday. What would it have been like for you to have been a disciple then? This man in whom you've put your trust, this man in whom you've put your hope, this man who has spoken to your soul in a way that no one before or since ever has now come to ruin. He's dead. And the movement he was trying to birth, the new life that he gave you and your family, the aspiration and the dreams that seemed to have come from heaven itself into your life are now gone. What do? Well, they hung out around Jerusalem not knowing what to do for 2 days, probably hiding somewhere in some rented room or somebody's basement or in some dark alley because they didn't know if they'd be killed either because they were disciples of Jesus. And then, on Easter Sunday morning, 2,000 years ago, a group of Jesus' female followers go to tend to the body, or maybe just to pray at his gravesite. And they come running back to his followers and say, he's not there. An angel told us that he had been raised from the dead. In that moment, how would you have felt? How would you have thought in their shoes? I wouldn't have believed it. You ever known anybody else who was risen from the dead? No. It was a tenet of the Jewish faith at the time that if you were a good Jew and believed what the Bible said, then you believed in the resurrection from the dead. Problem is, you've never seen it happen. Ever. And so in even the best Jews who believed every word of the Bible, you know there was at least a sliver of doubt that that was just poppycock, a pipe dream. And then they hear, Jesus is raised from the dead. And those hopes that had come crashing down maybe begin to pick up a little more life. Those dreams that had been cast aside maybe begin to reawaken. This is what happened to the disciples so long ago on an Easter Sunday morning when the sun rose, and their dreams and their hopes rose with it. When those same people, those first Christians, went out and they began to spread the news of this risen Jesus to everyone around them, and then eventually to the rest of the Mediterranean world, the known world, the Roman Empire, and far beyond, at the heart of what they would say was how their world, what they thought was possible, was radically changed so long ago on that first Easter Sunday. This is how the writer of the bulk of your New Testament, a guy named Paul, describes it in one of the opening verses of a letter he wrote to the capital city of the Roman Empire. He says that Jesus Christ our Lord was declared God's Son with power, exercised by the Spirit of holiness through his resurrection from the dead. He will say in another letter, 2 Timothy, to a young pastor protege of his, chapter 2, verse 8, that the sum total of his message is he preaches Jesus, the Son of David, risen from the dead. And those two things are important enough about Jesus that Paul goes on to say in the second half of that verse that he is willing to suffer great hardship simply because he's willing to preach that Jesus has risen from the dead. You realize that if Jesus had not risen from the dead, the disciples' lives that day so long ago would not have been changed. Not as radically as they were. Jesus was a great teacher. Almost everybody you know, even in America in the year 2014, will agree with you that Jesus was an extraordinary teacher. And that he had things to say about life that nobody else does. But according to Paul here, and according to the bulk of those first Christians as they spread out over the known world, that's irrelevant. Because he'd just be another dead good teacher if he had not been risen from the dead. In fact, what they say is that Jesus rose from the dead here in Romans chapter 4, verse 1, chapter 1, verse 4, is that Jesus is proven to be God's Son by the resurrection. All that stuff that Jesus said about himself being special, unique, different, God's special ambassador and emissary to the world, through whom God would act uniquely, all of that stuff is proven true according to the first Christians by the resurrection. And without the resurrection, you have no reason to believe that Jesus was God's Son. Not at all. Imagine, I like the word Paul uses here, imagine the power, the force, the strength, the energy, the drive. Imagine the power that it took to raise Jesus from the dead. You've never seen it happen before. Neither have I. Neither had them. Ever. Every life you've ever known, the lives that you've loved the most, your mother, your father, a sister, an uncle, a best friend. Every life that you've known that died, they remain dead. And yet, Jesus was risen from the dead. One time so far, one time, God did something that God could only do. God did something that on the surface of it seems impossible to us. He exercised a power we cannot imagine to raise this Jesus from the dead and prove once and for all who he is and why he matters so very much. Imagine again if Jesus had not been risen from the dead. Everybody, including his disciples, including you and me, 2,000 years later, would look at the cross and go, oh, what an act of injustice. That was such a good man. He was a great man who wanted great things for the lives around him and the world around him. He saw into the truth of things. What he said rang so true to my soul, and yet the powers that be won out. And they murdered this man. Ain't that the way? That's just the way the world is. And to that God said, no, that is not the way the world has to be. He said, I will exercise a power that only I can exercise, so that when you look at the cross and you go find his tomb, it will be empty, because we do not live in a world where injustice will ultimately win. Justice does. We do not live in a world where evil ultimately wins. Good does. We do not live in a world where fear and hate ultimately wins. We live in a world where love does. And the only reason you today can believe those things is because Jesus rose from the dead. Without it, you can't. That's why, by the way, in churches across the globe today, there are crosses draped in white. On Good Friday, you know what the color is? It's black. Because on Good Friday, it looks like everything that you know about the world and don't like. Everything you see in the world that does not sit well with you. The powers that be in the world that do not care. The indifference in the world that troubles you so. On Good Friday, it all comes to a head, and it causes the murder of Jesus. Good Friday is, without the resurrection, the blackest day the world's ever seen. And on Easter, it's white. Because the power of God says no. Good Friday is not the end of the story. God, being God, looks down from heaven and says, I cannot live with this. I am a God who is love and mercy and justice. I cannot live with this. And so he calls to his son Jesus and says, rise from the dead. I will exercise a power that only I have. I will do the impossible because I want the world to be as it should be. I want the world to be as I dream it to be. I want the world to be the place that you've heard Jesus describe. Injustice and hate and fear will not win. They have been toppled by the resurrection. This is how Jesus' followers early on describe the resurrection of Jesus. It is a unique, singular expression of God's power, screaming out to the world that Jesus is God's Son, and that everything Jesus stood for cannot be toppled. It cannot be taken away. It cannot be undone. And in the end, it will be victorious. That, however, is not the only way that Jesus' first followers describe the resurrection. They also do something that I think is kind of surprising. They describe the power of God's resurrection that he used to raise Jesus from the dead being available now. Listen to the words of that guy Paul, planter of most of the early churches, writer of most of your New Testament, from the same letter, the letter of Romans. This is Romans chapter 6, verse 4. Therefore, we as Christians have been buried with Jesus into death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of God the Father Almighty, so we too might walk in new life. 2 chapters later, he says in chapter 8, verse 11, if the Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies also, through that same Spirit that dwells in you. The way that Paul writes it in that verse on the screen from his letter to a church in southwest Turkey, Ephesus, is that it's as if lives are asleep. And the same power that rose Jesus from the dead now calls out to them to rise up from their slumber and be something completely different because of this Jesus who was resurrected. Now again, I want you to imagine. You've never seen, and neither have I, the power of death broken. The power of death surmounted. You've never seen it. Not with your eyes. You may believe in the resurrection of Jesus. You have never experienced anything like it. Imagine the sheer force of the power that it took for God to raise Jesus from the dead. To one time counter the normal way of nature, which is for something to be born, to live, and to die, and for that to be it. And one time, God said, no. I will do what only I can do. I will do what takes an ability and a power that none of us can imagine. It is far greater than any kind of energy or force that any of us can even begin to wrap our brains around. And now the first Christians say, guess what? That power is available to you right now in your lives. And God wants to bring that very same power to bear on changing your life now. Did you hear the way Paul described it? The same Spirit of God that rose Jesus from the dead is the same Spirit who calls out to you today to walk in a new life. The same God who rose Jesus from the dead now calls to you in your sleep and says, rise up and let the same power shine on you. That's incredible. To think that the same power that rose Jesus from the dead can now change me and you too. The very same one. The way that Paul describes the life of the normal human being in those verses that I read for you and the one on the screen is with two metaphors. He says that normal human life is number one, dead, and number two, asleep. Have you ever felt that way about your life? Have you gotten to the place where you felt painted into a corner, maybe of your own doing, and you felt like there was no way out? Maybe you felt like you made a dominoes set of choices that then began to come crashing down on you, and there was no way out. Yeah, that's what dead means. That's what asleep means. Maybe you feel like you've done things the same way for so long that there is such an inertia now, there is such a rut now that you can never change it. This has been going on for years, for decades in some cases. Yeah, that's what Paul means. You have believed the wrong things, you've had the wrong values, you've had the wrong priorities, you've spent your time in wrong ways. You've lived your life like everybody else, just obeying the status quo. That's what Paul means by dead and asleep. And when the first Christians arrived in towns all over the Mediterranean world, they would talk about this risen Jesus, this miraculous, supernatural thing that God did, declaring him his son. And they would say, if you think that's extraordinary, the same God who did that for Jesus, calling him out of the grave, wants to call you out of your grave too, right now. You don't have to wait until you kick the bucket. You don't have to wait until we go to your funeral to hope for resurrection. You can have it right now. This is what the first Christians preached. This takes honesty on our part, however. You and I have to be willing to admit that, yes, there are times and there are ways in which, if we were candid, our lives look dead and our lives look asleep. What are the ways you're dead this morning? What are the ways you're asleep this morning? What are the ways I am? Are you tired? You've been working so hard in your life to get where you want to go. You're tired. Hey, you're asleep. You need to wake up. What are your ways this morning that you feel dead, that you feel asleep? It is to you that the scriptures say resurrection power is available to you. You can be different beginning today. It'll be a long journey. The most important change never happens overnight in most cases, but you can start today. We can make a 90-degree turn. We can change course. How are you dead? How are you asleep? God wants to target you with the same power that he'd had and used to raise Jesus from the dead. How do you feel dead and asleep this morning? I ran across this last week an article online in the last and latest issue of a Christian periodical called The Christian Century, written by someone like me, a pastor. His name is Matt Fitzgerald. And he was writing in advance of Easter Sunday, because we all know that Easter Sunday is the Sunday when most people in America go to church. We all put out extra chairs because we know extra people are coming. We anticipate that we may even have to have, if you're in a larger church, an extra service because more people are coming. And he writes this very thoughtful reflection on why that is that most people come to church on Easter Sunday of all Sundays. See if you don't agree with part of what he said. He writes, if people come to church to hear about our reasons for Christianity, then Easter would not be the most popular Sunday of the year, because there is nothing sensible about the resurrection. Easter ought to leave us preachers scratching our heads. We are not able to define or even describe the resurrection that well. The empty tomb does not fit into our normal human categories or understanding. We prize our mind's ability to penetrate, to grasp, to order, and to assimilate. But in this particular case, our stupefaction is a very good thing. As Archbishop Rowan Williams has said, you only get anywhere near to the truth when all the easy things that we say about God are dismantled. You only get anywhere near the truth when all the sensible things to say about God are overwhelmed by the fact that Jesus just stepped out of the grave. Easter gives us the opportunity to name the faith that we aspire to. We long for a God who cannot be contained, cannot be confined, and really can't even be described. A God whose victory over the grave can redefine our lives. I don't know why you're here today, even if you're a Christian person. I suspect for many of you, you came out of habit. Maybe you came because somebody twisted your arm enough for you to be here. I think Matt Fitzgerald is right. The reason why this Sunday of all Sundays is most attended in America is because it speaks to what we hope for. It speaks to something deep down inside of us that is definitively human. It speaks to the language of our souls. Know what it says? In your life, you are used to being asleep. living among people who are asleep, who just go through the routine, they go through the motions, and they are wasting their life away. You are used to a world in which death wins every single time. And every mind in the room, all our collective reason in the room, would come to that conclusion together. And yet, here we sit, gathered on an Easter Sunday, because we hope for something different. We yearn for something different. As Matt Fitzgerald says, we yearn for a God who cannot be confined or contained or even scarcely described. We yearn for one who can call Jesus from the grave, which means that he can redefine our own lives too. You are here because you hope for resurrection. You hope that the stories of Jesus' resurrection so long ago are true, and you hope that the God who exercised an impossible power to raise that Jesus can do the same for you. That's why I'm here too. Would you take a minute here at the end of the message and just pause for a moment? Up on the screen are some summaries of what we talked about today. Give God some space right now in the quiet to maybe remind you of what you need to take from here. Maybe show you where you need to begin to believe the impossible about how he can change you. Because if he raised Jesus from the dead, it will not be that hard for him to raise you from your death, from your slumber, from who you are right now either. Be brave. Stretch out and trust him. And ask him to begin to change you too, with the same power he exercised 20 centuries ago. Take a moment in the quiet, speak to God and let him speak to you, and then I will pray for us all.